While most of you are enjoying Total War Warhammer 3 and speculations about its upcoming DLC, many of its older followers are more excited about the new historical game likely brewing on the horizon, as the creative assembly looks set to return to them in 2023. But the recent pattern has been that every major release is followed by a Saga title, and in today's episode of My Two Cents, I argue it's time for the Sagas to be killed off, permanently. But before we get to why this is a good thing, you should probably know how it all went wrong. See, in 2019, to help fill in breaks between Warhammer DLC and major releases, CA launched their controversial Saga series, pitched as smaller, more geographically focused historical titles that would be standalone. These smaller titles would keep players engaged through major content gaps and give up-and-coming game designers chances to experiment with unique mechanics and design choices without having the pressure of a big-budget game. The initial idea for Saga titles came from the success of Fall of the Samurai for Shogun II and Age of Charlemagne for Attila, both of which were largely divorced from their parent games, well-received, and could have been sold as standalone titles, not requiring players to own the base game to purchase them, and removing a possible barrier for entry. Fall of the Samurai was even renamed as a Saga title retroactively, as it fit this so well. Both of these were essentially mega-sized DLC, or what we used to call expansion packs, with unique animations, units, and maps that were sold for under $20 US. It was understood that Saga titles would be built like this, using assets from existing titles and sharing some of their underlying features and animations. So the idea of a half-priced game for $30 that included mega DLC levels of detail was initially well received. And that's important here. For many older historical players, the perception was that the Creative Assembly had refocused almost entirely to fantasy-based games, and anything that didn't have a spellbook or monsters attached was considered a win for the historical community. The Total War Saga, Thrones of Britannia, suffered from bad PR at launch and had a rough time balancing fan expectations and production budgets as a $40 title. It was rightly called an extra-large Attila DLC, as that is the engine and foundation that it was branched from, and was inspired by much older medieval Total War Viking invasion. It was a real throwback in terms of content and playstyle, and I unabashedly loved it. But for anyone coming from Warhammer, it felt like a distinct step backwards to an older style of game. Instead of forging ahead by adding DLC with new factions or campaigns to maintain a player base and help energize them, all of Thrones' post-release development time went to correcting perceived slights or missteps. Generally, people who play the game today enjoy Thrones, but it remains one of the least played modern Total War games. Thrones' sales were also hindered by the announcement of Total War 3 Kingdoms before its release. A full release that wasn't a saga, that also had both historic and fantasy modes. Then came a Total War Saga Troy, a full game this time, oddly labeled as a saga title, that disastrously decided to meet in the middle of fantasy and history with the truth behind the myth approach. It wasn't fantasy enough for Warhammer players and too Age of Mythology for most historical fans who wanted a Bronze Age game. It was also priced at $60, so even more money was spent to try and correct the problem by making an Age of Mythology DLC called Mythos. If you've noticed a pattern here about CA injecting fantasy elements to attract Warhammer players, you're not alone. With Troy, it was notoriously sold to Epic Games to be an exclusive for the first year of its release. The game was even given away for free in the first 24 hours after its release, which looked for all intents and purposes like offloading a big bag of crap for an easy paycheck. In a roundabout way, though, Troy was a victim of scope creep and bad feedback. For Thrones of Britannia, people expected more in the broadest sense of the word, and as the games with fantasy elements were selling best, this is what CA Sophia was likely told to incorporate more of to help increase sales. And the Troy team worked their hardest to give it to CA. By the time CA Sophia, who, by the way, this was their first ever full title they had done under the new company, by the time they were done with Troy, there were 8 unique factions, each with bespoke mechanics and hundreds of new art assets and animations. To cover the cost of production, it had to become a full-price title, yet it was already advertised as a Saga. The Creative Assembly also got a new CEO around this time, and negative first impression videos must have convinced him that there was no possible way for Troy to earn its money back. And I feel partly to blame for this. Content creators have far more influence in a game's early pre-sales than you'd think. And my review of Troy was one of the harshest, and if anyone at CA Sophia happens to hear this, I apologize for some of my harsher criticisms. It's only when you get this 2 years later review that you really can see the surrounding nonsense that had to be fought through to even get this game made. I mean, the level of innovation shown in Troy is nothing short of extraordinary. The photo mode in particular is an amazing resource for anyone that records Total War. I still feel the half-historic, half-fantasy approach ignored what players from both genres wanted, but by the time it was in our hands to review, it was too late to change before launch. I mean, the fact that there was a later Mythos DLC which included separated historical and fantasy modes shows that the team realized they had missed the mark, and more importantly, tried to correct it. It was only with this final DLC that I could really appreciate how much work CA Sophia had put into it. I mean, look at this. This is a recreated map of Mycenae, the capital of the Greek faction. And this is what it looks like in the game. This siege map is almost a one-to-one replica of the actual historic location. That is nuts. And there are so many other tiny historic details and daring ideas that were hidden away beneath a mountain of bad PR and difficult game decisions. Again though, by the time it was fixed, it was too little, too late. Today, Troy is even less played than Thrones of Britannia on Steam. Both Saga titles had around 9 months of post-release development support, where the developers actively would patch it or try and make new DLC for the games. Total War 3 Kingdoms had 2 years, and ended with a notable letdown. Yet Total War Warhammer has been supported continuously in one form or another since 2016. If full historical titles were second priority, then Saga titles were an afterthought. This perceived favoritism has driven a deep wedge within the Total War community, leading to the creation of subreddits dedicated solely to either historical or fantasy games that are very active. And, not surprisingly, the historical players feel that with each new Saga title, they're being handed an increasingly short stick. Which brings us back to the next Total War game releasing in 2023. It will likely be historical, and based on the recent pattern of main release Saga, it would be a Saga title's turn. But should it be? To use a colloquialism, the name A Total War Saga is mud. It's not worth the paper it's written on, and labeling a game as a saga ensures that any prospective players think of it as cut corners, low budgets, botched releases, and filler content between Warhammer. It's not a fair sentiment, but it is the mood in the room. If that single word, saga, can conjure nothing but negative imagery, it should be dropped. I mean, players have already shown that anything less than a full historical release would be contentious at best, and expect full release style polish and support from any of these games. Troy was indistinguishable from a full release, except in name, to fulfill these expectations. I mean, the only real difference was the scale of the game and the supposed lack of cultural diversity, a critique that would have been hard to imagine a decade ago back when Shogun 2 released. Oh, how far we've come! And in their way, the Saga titles helped us to get there, and many of the mechanics developed for them have appeared in later games. Sagas were pitched as experimental testbeds for exactly this purpose, but the Sagas themselves were ultimately seen as small releases with short-term support that were largely abandoned, both by the developers and the players. But it's hard not to see them now as a way for the parent company Sega to boast that they have annual game releases. Something that potential investors love to hear as it ensures regular annual income. Games like Call of Duty and Madden have mastered this yearly format, and the Sagas may have been an attempt by CA to capitalize on it, offering something new and different every year to entice players. But strategy game players have shown a profound desire to see continual DLC and support for the games they love, as long as the company is willing to keep making them, fostering the thriving modding communities with tens of thousands of daily players, and have historically been willing to pay out the ears to get new content, something the architect behind the Saga titles seems to have missed. Imagine a world where Thrones of Britannia wasn't a Saga title, but instead stuck around with support for years after, its map reused for DLC covering the Saxon invasions in King Arthur, the Scottish independence wars with William Wallace, the War of the Roses, or even the English Civil War. All games we are less likely to ever see now because the Saga title already used the England setting. So maybe it's time for the Creative Assembly to think about its games as platforms for continuing epics instead of these one-off sagas, and kill them off for good. But that's just my 2 cents. What do you think? Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. You can always subscribe to this channel for more editorials and actual Total War news in the future, and support us here on Patreon. But as always, regardless of what you do, thanks for watching.